In our lessons so far, we've talked a lot about how to find real love. And one of the most common questions that I get is, what does loving look like? So when I find it, how will I know? When I'm giving it, how will I know? What are the characteristics? One suggestion that I make right off is don't think in terms of perfectly loving. In the first place, it's almost non-existent. So there are two problems that I can think of just right off the top of my head. It's way too difficult to find, so you'll hunt forever and you won't find it because your standards are too high. And second, when you do encounter some loving, either toward you or from you, you'll miss it if you're looking for perfect. So think small. Think in steps that would take you toward loving, rather than setting a standard that where you've somehow arrived. I get asked that question all the time. So how long did it take you to become loving? And usually my response is, I'll let you know when that happens. In the pursuit of it, though, I can give you some clues. And we're going to talk today about one of the biggest ones, one of the biggest characteristics of loving. And that is that the single most important and most immediate form of loving that we can offer another person is to listen. I've counseled with couples, and by couples I mean any two people, married partners, parent, child, boss, employee, any two people interact uncounted thousands of times now. And I've seen more miraculous changes happen as a result of listening than from anything else by far. Why? Because to truly listen is to focus entirely on another person. And that is loving. Another way of saying that is this: to truly listen is to inhale the soul of the person who is speaking. I love the poetry of that. It's a bold statement, but each time another person speaks, they're sharing their soul with you. By soul, I'm not referring to some religious entity, but their inner thoughts, their needs, their fears, everything, whether they realize it or not. When people speak, they're revealing themselves. And if you listen to all that, you inhale who they are, which is what I mean by their soul. Paul Tillich said the first duty of love is to listen. Notice, that's the first duty. It's the most important thing you can do. You can buy someone lovely gifts for all of their anniversaries, for when they graduated from the 6th grade, for their coming out party when they were 16, for their wedding anniversary, for Christmas, for Valentine's Day. You can do all that stuff. You can tell them you love them. These things are actually fairly easy to do. But if you then ignore what they say, they will not feel loved, which is why David Augsburger said an open ear is the only believable sign of an open heart. Notice he didn't say an open mouth. And I almost want to apologize for the fact that in this particular class, I'm going to be opening mine almost the entire time. I wish you were here so that I could listen to you. It would be so much more meaningful. But in this particular class today, it is my function to talk. Mortimer Adler, who famous philosopher and an incredible compiler of other people's writings, said love without conversation is impossible. Conversation, not just talking. Without true listening, there is no conversation. Or Elton Mayo, famous physician, said one friend, one person, one who is truly understanding, who takes the trouble to listen to us as we consider our problem, can change our whole outlook on the world. That sounds like an overstatement. I assure you that it is not. I cannot count how many times people have said to me, this is the first time I've ever felt like somebody really understood me. Now, why did they say that? Because I listened to them. I enjoy listening to people. There is no greater privilege than for another human being to share their soul with you. And that's how I feel when people speak to me. How can you feel loved, in fact, until you feel understood? One of the greatest compliments is when somebody says to me, "You get me." And this understanding can't happen until there's profound, genuine listening. In past lessons, we've talked about the importance of exactly this process in the finding of real love, and you recognize this particular diagram. We tell the truth. We create opportunities to feel seen, accepted, and then loved. If you really listen to me, you've got me. You've got my attention, my appreciation, my loyalty, my cooperation. When you find someone who really listens to you, you've got a friend, often for life. I've had instances where people have communicated to me years and years later after I had a single conversation with them, not particularly an in-depth conversation, where people have said, "You're the only person in my life who's ever listened." Now, don't be mistaken that I'm flattering my ability to listen. I'm really talking about how horribly the rest of the world listens. By comparison, I look like a listener. Listening is not the same as, for example, sympathizing, or a lot of things that we do instead of listening. And we're going to get into that more here in just a little bit. Just as listening is the first and perhaps most important step in loving, our failure to listen is a disaster. And it is a fact that, in general, we believe we are listening when we are not. And as long as we believe this lie, as long as we persist in this self-deception that we're listening, we're not, we'll never be motivated to learn to actually listen. We are confused between listening and hearing. My ears can hear without my brain understanding a single word that is spoken. In China, for example, where I've been now a couple of times, I heard a lot of talking, but I didn't listen very well because they were speaking in a language I didn't understand. I tried to listen, but that's not the same. I couldn't genuinely listen. When I tell people that they're not listening, they often say, not listening to me, not listening to their partner. The most frequent response by quite a bit is, "Oh, no, I was listening. I was." They mean that when the other person was speaking, they were sitting still and not running from the room screaming, or they were not playing a video game while the other person was speaking. No, they were just simulating listening. They allowed the vibrations of the other person's voice to roll over them like a wave. Well, not exactly a great accomplishment, since the trees in my backyard can do that much. So what do we do instead of listening? One of the things we do is to be thinking of our response. Oh, we do this all the time. I have on occasion been talking to a couple and just taken notes as they're talking to each other, and taken everything he says and everything she says and put them side by side, and then shown them a transcript of what they were saying. You can't tell they're in the same room. No kidding. One of the reasons, I love to quote this guy because I love to say his name. One of the things that Francois de la Rochefoucauld said, that's about the extent of my French, is one of the reasons why so few people are to be found who seem sensible and pleasant in conversation is that almost everybody is thinking about what he wants to say himself rather than about answering clearly what is said to him. So you watch yourself and you watch other people, and you're waiting, or they're patiently waiting until one person stops speaking, and then we interject with what we wanted to say in the first place. It's almost like we build the emotional capital to pretend to listen so that we can then speak, which actually brings us to the next thing that we do instead of listening, which is we're waiting to speak. Pretty much the same as the thing that we already talked about. We pretend to be listened, to be polite, but it's only to give us the opportunity to speak ourselves. Our pretended listening creates a sense of like obligation in the other person to then listen to us. Ironically, they are pretending to listen too. So we listen so that now they have to, and it turns out nobody's listening to anybody, and hence there is no genuine communication. Stephen Covey said, most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. They are either speaking or preparing to speak. That's not listening. So another thing that we do instead of listening is we defend ourselves. Now, some really powerful evidence that either you're defending yourself or the other person's defending himself or herself are the words, but. So somebody speaks to you, say, well, but you're defending, certainly not listening. Or the word no, I think. On more than one occasion, I have given in to an irresistible temptation, and probably not with ultimate kindness, to say to someone what I said the other day to a woman. I said, every time I speak a sentence, do you realize that in our conversation so far, in the last 5 minutes, every time I've spoken, you have responded with the word but or the word no? This was just too easy a setup. So, of course, what did she say? She said, no, I don't. She couldn't help herself. She couldn't help falling into the trap. She defends herself so much that it was that easy to illustrate to her that she was being defensive. Of course, she didn't realize she was doing it then even then. And even then defended the fact that she was saying but and no. Another thing that we do instead of listening is to change the subject. This is a favorite. So, and I'll just change who's the subject here. Sometimes it'll be a woman speaking, sometimes a man, and I try to make it 50-50. And if I screw up, well, send me an email. So she says, I'd like to go out to eat tonight. And he says, I'm kind of tired. Or, I don't know if we can afford it. So, without realizing it, he's changed the subject by defending his position. How? Because when we defend, we're changing the subject from the speaker to ourselves. So notice, she says, I would like to go out to eat tonight. What does he respond? I'm kind of tired. He didn't hear her at all. He was telling her what he wants to do. I don't know if we can afford it, meaning I don't know if I want to pay for it. Almost every time somebody speaks, the subject is them, not necessarily the words that they're using. So what if you were to, what would be some examples of listening using the example that we just used? So she says, I'd like to go out to eat tonight. An example of listening would be paying attention to her. Well, you deserve a night out. That would be an example of listening. The subject was her. And if you say, well, yeah, you deserve a night out, you've preserved the subject, her. Or he might say, are you feeling tired? I mean, as hard as you work, it's understandable that you would feel tired. What's he doing? He's retaining the subject, her. Or he could say, there's so many different ways to do it. There's not just one way to listen. I'm giving you like just 3. He could say, well, I don't blame you. After, eating the inedible garbage that you cook night after night, I should think that you'd want something tasty. I wouldn't suggest that. But notice that he's at least retained the subject, her. He's listening, even though the last one would be probably not as well received as the first 2. Now, understanding that listening is about focusing on the other person. Here's a very tricky thing that we do instead of listening. We sympathize. When we sympathize, unintentionally, we do the second to the last item listed on that PowerPoint. We are changing the subject. Now, this is really sneaky and subtle, so pay attention, or if you'll excuse me, listen. When somebody talks about their pain, they're talking about their pain. The instant we sympathize, we're expressing our opinion of their pain. We just change the subject. Now, why is this a problem? Because my opinion of your pain is a different subject from your pain. They may seem like they're related. We may be trying to do a nice thing, but it's a different subject. And my sympathy isn't truly loving. Why? Because sympathy doesn't make people feel genuinely loved. It makes them feel like victims. It doesn't make people feel genuinely happy. And if it doesn't make people feel genuinely happy, then it's not truly loving. My opinion, my sympathy is about me. So this is sneaky stuff. Sympathy is not true understanding. Sympathy often doesn't demonstrate true understanding of the speaker. An example. A friend says to you that her mother died or her child is struggling in school. And we say, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Now, 99 out of 100 people would say, well, that's a kind thing to say. In fact, that's what 99 out of 100 of us would say. If you doubt that, go to a wake and stand behind the spouse of somebody who's just died and hear how often you hear that. I just want you to know how sorry I am. After a while, she must wonder if anybody can say anything else. It sounds kind, but without understanding, it can be foolish and even annoying. For example, what if the other person that you're talking to isn't sorry at all? And you've changed the subject to your sorrow. What if, for example, they're happy their mother died? Now, there could be a variety of reasons for that. Maybe because they're just finally glad to have their mother out of their hair. Or it may be that their mother's been sick for 20 years and in pain. And they're tickled to have their mother out of pain. You don't know what's going on in their head. So to change the subject to, oh, I'm so sorry, is really not listening. Or what if the mother who's talking about a struggling child is actually glad that the child is finally learning from this struggle, as opposed to being catered to and sympathized with and enabled by teachers and everybody else? People simply want to be heard, listened to in their pain. Sympathy is an attempt, this is sneaky because it sounds kind, but it's not. Sympathy is an attempt to lessen the pain instead of hearing it. See? And mostly we're trying to lessen the pain for ourselves. So in a little bit, we'll talk about how to listen in such circumstances where, for example, a child is struggling or somebody has died. We'll get to that. But right now, the subject is a more general understanding of sympathy rather than how to do it differently. Sympathy makes you the speaker. It makes you the subject of the conversation, not the speaker. And we talked about that concept, briefly earlier. One of the principles of listening is one speaker. So if somebody speaks about their pain and then you talk about your sympathy, you just change the speaker again, and that person's not going to feel listened to. Sympathy also fosters victimhood. As soon as we, I'm so sorry, poor you, that's imitation love, and it doesn't lead to happiness. An example from the one that we've been using already. Somebody tells me that their mother's died, and we tend to say, oh, I'm so sorry. Well, what if they're thrilled? Like we talked about, chronic illness or whatever. Then they have to lie now. They have to say, oh, well, thank you. Or they have to act all sad. And if enough people pass by in the line and say, oh, gee, I'm so sorry, well, by the end of the night, the person who hears this 100 times in a row is going to feel sad. It's not genuine caring. And when we say, I'm so sorry, we're sad, so the person that we're talking to now often feels like they have to take care of us in our grief, which is crazy, because I have stood in the line behind somebody whose relative has just died. And you know what they spend the whole night doing? They spend the whole night, this is nuts, saying, oh, well, that's okay. They end up consoling the people who came to the funeral, which is not the object. They're also the people who often end up making the food, and the way we do funerals and wakes is just really kind of crazy, because we give more responsibility to the relatives of the people who died, and then we make them comfort us. Or then they feel obligated when we say we're sorry to say thank you. See how we've twisted this around? We're not loving them, we're making them love us. And then we're back to the victimhood, which is very distracting. And often keeps people in grief for a very long time. People get calls, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. And so they feel like, well, now I have to grieve. And I have to keep grieving for months, or I'm not going to appear like I really loved my husband or wife or whoever it is that died. The whole thing is just a mess because nobody's really listening. We're going to get to more of this later. But because we listen so rarely and poorly, real communication is just almost non-existent. In fact, there's a lady named Rebecca West who said there's no such thing as even conversation. It's an illusion. There are only intersecting monologues. That's all. What a beautiful turn of phrase. I wish I'd said that. What is a huge problem with this almost universal business of not listening? As I stated earlier, a huge problem is that we believe we are listening when we're not. The worst of all problems are not those that we can identify. We can do something about those. No matter how big they are, at least we can address them. The worst problems are the ones we don't see, or just as bad, the ones that we deny. So we must learn to identify our not listening. So how do you tell if you're not listening? Lots of ways. We're going to go through a bunch of them. But one way is that the other person keeps repeating themselves. So I've been involved in so many conversations like this, I can't count them. So the man says to me, and it could be a man or a woman, I'm just kind of alternating. The man says to me, my wife says the same thing to me day after day after day, over and over. I want to shoot myself. Actually, I want to shoot her. And so I ask, do you know why she repeats herself? And the answer is always the same. No. Well, in many cases, I've listened to them talk to each other, so I already know the answer, but really I'd kind of know the answer even if I hadn't heard them talk to each other. I say, she repeats herself because you don't listen to her. So she has to repeat herself. It's become a pattern now that she does without even thinking. I was talking to a man in England just recently, and he was talking about how his wife repeats herself over and over and over and over. I said, have you noticed in the conversations that we've had, you and me, you and her, she and I, have you noticed that she doesn't repeat herself with me? Well, he had not noticed that. And then I turned to her and I said, why is it that each time you've said something to me, you've only said it once? And she said, because you listened to me. I'm not sure he got the point. But when people are listened to, they tend not to repeat themselves. Another example, we've all seen the child in line at the grocery store or Walmart or wherever who tugs on his or her mother's skirt saying, Mommy, 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 Mommy. You know, after about the 17th time that I've heard Mommy, I want to walk up and ask her if the child belongs to her. I'd like to introduce you to your son. Because she must not know who he is to not listen that many times. We train kids, we've all been trained as kids to repeat ourselves. She's taught the child that right about the 19th time the kid says mommy and is now screaming it, she's taught the child that's when she'll listen. So what do children do? They've learned that they have to say the same thing over and over again, and eventually they learn to just go ahead and start in at the higher volume. And we do all that by not listening. To prove this point, imagine that you say something to me and I listen to you completely. Imagine this, because many of us have never had this experience. You know I understand you. There's no doubt. You know that I accept you. You know that I get you. You know that I get every word you just said. Now, would you repeat what you just said to me? It wouldn't even make sense, would it? Of course you wouldn't. If you know I'm listening to you and I indicate to you that I'm listening to you, that I get you, why would you say it again? It would be kind of stupid like, right? Now, in fairness, is this thing that we've got on the PowerPoint, the other person keeps repeating themselves as an indication of not listening. Is this entirely true in all cases? No. It's like a generalization. It's like a guideline. It's like a hint that we're not listening. There are exceptions. Some people are so empty and afraid that they repeat themselves just out of habit. It's just a thing that they chronically do. They've never been listened to, so they use words like machine gun bullets to get their point across, or as evidence that they're right. So therefore, the more words they use, the better. So they don't hear anything. They just keep talking. To be right, to protect themselves, to what? It's just a habit. I ran into a woman recently, and she never shut up. She talked from the minute I introduced myself. She would have talked all day long. I could have gone to lunch, come back. She would have still been talking. And eventually, I just put my hand up and said, honey, I'm listening to you. You don't have to repeat it. So I summarized what she was saying in just a few sentences, and I said, did I miss anything? No. I said, then you don't need to say it again. I got it. Example, I run into people every day who've never been listened to. So like this woman, when I listen to them thoroughly, they repeat because first, they don't recognize that I am listening because they've never seen this. They never had anybody listen to them. And two, it's just habit. They can't stop themselves. These are the adults who, as children, had to get their parents' attention by saying, mommy, 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 mommy. So as adults, they do it except with more words. Some people repeat themselves because they believe that listening means getting what they want, means you're doing what they want. So if you say no, they believe you're not listening because their needs outweigh everything else in the universe. They've defined listening as complying, and that's not the same thing. I can listen to you thoroughly and understand everything you said, and yet say, no, I choose not to do that. But there's some people so empty and who have been denied for so long and felt unloved and destitute, and they're so desperate that if you don't do what they want, they call that not listening. So any failure to gratify their needs is unacceptable. They say people are not listening when that is not true. Example, children at bedtime. Children don't want to go to bed. And so children often feel not listened to simply when you require that they, actually go to bed and get enough sleep so that they're not absolute holy terrors the next day. A cocaine addict would define listening as you giving him or her the next dose of cocaine. And here you are genuinely listening to their situation and you're helping them to withdraw. Well, they would call that not listening. Victims define listening or loving as giving them the sympathy they want. And if you don't give it to them, they call that not listening. Recently, this was such a great example. Participated in an intervention with a couple. And he actually lived in a different city from her. She said he never listened. I talked to him at length. He moved back home. They came here. He learned to hear her, which he had never done before. The man talked so much he couldn't possibly have given her room to speak. So he learned to listen, but then she discovered an entirely different level, another level of anger or fury or disappointment, because it became apparent that in order for her to call it listening, he had to give her everything thing she wanted. He could never disagree with a single thing that she said or wanted, or she would say. He wasn't listening. It turns out in the beginning, he really wasn't listening. But once he learned to listen, she still didn't feel listened to because she had the wrong definition of what listening is, which many of us do, especially if we're victims or controllers. Another way to tell if you're not listening is that the other person gets angry. When people are angry at us, what are they usually saying? They're saying they don't feel loved. And on the whole, there's no way that people feel truly listened to, but not loved by us. So if they're angry, the odds are very high that we're not listening. But remember the exceptions that we talked about. You might be listening, but they're simply in too much pain to see that you're listening, to, if you like, hear that you're listening. Or they want something that you choose not to give. You're not feeding their victimhood, for example. And so they become angry even though you are listening to them. Another way to tell that you're not listening is that the other person is unhappy, pretty much as like we just talked about with the other person being angry. Listening is loving, so people do tend to feel happier when you're listening. But there are the exceptions that we talked about. They're not the rule, but they happen. You might be listening, but they're in too much pain to perceive that you are listening, or they want something that you choose not to give. So now, the really big question, we talked about what not listening is like. We talked about how important listening is. What does real listening look like? Or, in this case, sound like? True listening means focusing entirely on the other person. It's really not a whole lot more complicated than that. If you're listening, you'll do this. You'll be focusing on the other person. If you're not focusing on the other person, there's no way you could be listening. So, true listening means focusing entirely on the other person, and you can't be thinking of yourself. So there can be no getting and protecting behaviors. Zero. Examples. Anger, withdrawing, arguing, and so on. If I'm angry at you, who am I thinking about? I'm thinking about myself. There's no way that I can be listening. Sometimes we get angry and we say, I understand what you're saying. Not if you're angry, you don't. And repeating is not listening if you're the slightest bit irritated. Why? Back to what I mentioned just a minute ago. Why can there be no getting and protecting behaviors in true listening? Because getting and protecting behaviors are all about us. And listening means to focus on the other person. Listening is selfless. Let's look just for kicks at the getting and protecting behaviors. So if I'm lying, who am I thinking about? Me. If I'm attacking, I'm angry at you, I'm thinking about me. I couldn't possibly be listening to you. I might be hearing little bits of what you're saying, but I'm not really listening to you. If I'm acting like a victim, I'm thinking about me. If I'm clinging, me. Running, me. I can't be doing any of these things and be truly listening. And here's something we often miss in listening, because listening understandably brings the word sound or words to mind, just as seeing brings to mind the words, say, objects or pictures. But there's so much more to listening than words, as demonstrated by the use of these getting and protecting behaviors. We need to listen to the other person much more than to the words that are being said. In fact, words can actually be a distraction. Many people, for example, create their own little worlds with their words. People who feel like victims, for example, by using enough words, each word becomes a brick, if you like, and builds a virtual world buildings, complete with buildings and fake people and false perspectives. People who are trying to avoid responsibility do the same thing. These people get lost in their words. In fact, you can pretty much write this down as a law. We'll call it the law of words just for fun because, well, I decided to. The more words people use, the more they are in pain. The more they are trying to either get imitation love, or they are protecting themselves, or both. So people use words like bricks to build walls to protect themselves, or they use them like bricks to throw at other people. So they're getting or they are protecting. Victims do this all day long with their words. Whine, whine. They can think of a million ways to tell you how you did even just a single thing wrong. Controllers do the same thing. They explain to you with a million words why it is that you should do exactly as they want you to do. There was a lady who was talking to me one day about her husband, and he was in the room, sitting right next to her, in fact. And she talked for about 15 minutes about how he didn't listen, how he didn't touch her, how he was critical, how he was blah, blah, blah. Why I let that go on for 15 minutes, I can't really tell you. I was probably on some kind of medication, I can't remember. But 15 minutes she went on about all the terrible things he does. That's nearly 1,000 seconds. And when she finally stopped, his response was, he said, I don't know what to say. I wanted to say, me neither. He could not listen to that onslaught of words for 1,000 seconds. So I asked her, I said, do you mind if I summarize what you just said to him? She said, okay. So I said, all your life, from early childhood to right now, nobody has ever really paid attention to you to the point that you felt loved. And now your husband is continuing that lifelong pattern, which is very painful to you. She looked like I'd hit her. She was stunned. I asked her if that summary left out anything truly important. If I'd left out anything that she had said in her previous 15 minutes, anything that matters. She said, no, that's pretty much what I was trying to say. I said, how long did it take me to say what I just said? Well, I'd looked down at my watch, so I knew. She didn't know. I said, that took me 15 seconds. I asked him for a response. I said, now respond to what I just said. He said, and I'm going to quote now, I feel like this is to her. He says, I feel like I understand you much better. And now I can see why you don't feel loved by me. And I feel bad about that. She'd been trying to get him to say that for 10 years. He listened far better to my summary, even though she used 60 times more words and a whole lot more emotional content, animation. Another woman went through a litany of her life's traumas, how this person and that person had done this and that and on and on. And finally, I just reached over with my hand and took her by the back of the head and just put her head on my shoulder. I didn't say a word. And she cried for 10 minutes. So I summarized her life with a moment of understanding, 0 words, and she bawled like a child. So there's a lesson here. More listening is not better listening. We tend to think more is better. Well, I'm guilty of that too. If a 1 horsepower motor is good, then a 10 horsepower motor is better. But it turns out that when it comes to listening, that's not true. More is not better. But in the beginning, more listening sometimes is needed. That's in the beginning. When I first meet somebody, I will listen to them talk about their life story and the ways that they've been hurt much longer, because they need some kind of demonstration that you're willing to invest your time in them. to them, it's a form of caring. But then if you keep listening to the same story over and over and over again, that's not listening. That's helplessness on your part, lack of courage to summarize what they're saying, lack of experience perhaps, or sympathizing, but it's not really listening. But no matter how you listen, and we're going to talk about how to listen in some detail, no matter how you listen to people, you have to remember that listening is not a technique. I'm going to probably say this more than once because people ask me all the time, so how do you listen? It's not a technique. It's not something you read about in a book. There are how many books written on communication? Oh my goodness. And people said, well, I've tried that book and it didn't work. Or I tried that book and it did work. You know, if you learn a communication style or technique, it might work for a little while. Do you know why? Because simply by reading it and paying attention to the other person, even if it's just mechanically, the other person feels cared about. Just like great sex is not the same as love, and love tends to produce great sex. Well, even though sex is not love, if two people read, for example, a sexual techniques book, much like a listening techniques book, it can actually work for a few weeks. Why? Not because they're doing the techniques. It's not about a physical technique. It's because they're paying attention to each other. So how do I listen? Again, I listen by focusing on you. And I can't do that if I'm afraid or needy or distracted. Now, I warned you that I was going to repeat this, so here we are. Listening is not a technique. Many techniques have been described for effective listening and communication, but they just uniformly fail to produce significant and lasting positive changes in relationships because they ignore the powerful primal need that we all have to feel unconditionally loved. One element of communication that is often taught, for example, is our need to acknowledge what we've heard, to echo or reflect back to the listener what he or she has said. Some books call this active listening. And that can be a potentially useful approach, but it doesn't lead to the most effective communication if the need for real love is disregarded. So, for example, we have seen people do active communication. So imagine that you're angry and you're expressing this to your spouse. I mean, your hair's on fire. It's kind of obvious that you're angry. And your spouse says, using the active communication technique, so I hear that you're angry. And right about then, you want to punch them in the face. It's like, duh, I'm angry. They're not really listening. They can repeat that you're angry, but they don't understand, for example, why you're angry. They don't understand the underlying pain. They can't state, nor do they understand the part that they have played in this particular moment of anger. They don't show any indication that they want to understand. And so even though they say, so I understand that, I see that you're angry, is not a fulfilling thing to hear. Every time somebody speaks to you, he or she is offering you a very personal gift, literally a part of who he or she is. And how you listen is naturally perceived as a strong indication of how you receive that gift. Genuine listening is so much more than simply receiving and acknowledging words with mechanical communications techniques. When we really listen, we communicate to our spouses, for example, or children or whoever, that we care about them. When you listen, you're telling the other person that he or she is important to you. Real listening, simply, is an expression of love. In fact, the principal goal of listening is not to hear the words. It's not to be able to regurgitate facts. It's not even to grow in understanding of the other person. The principal goal of listening, although that can be a part of it, the principal goal of listening is to communicate love. But even though real love is the key ingredient to real listening, I'm going to still nonetheless describe here some of the somewhat mechanical characteristics of listening. And maybe from these, we can learn better how to listen to our spouses, children, coworkers, and so on in ways that are accepting and productive if we are also loving. If you do these techniques and you're not loving, you will fail. I would also add, however, that these techniques can be helpful because they're very difficult to fake without real love. Not for long. You can pretend some of these things for a while, but eventually you're going to be identified. You're going to be found out. So, some of the characteristics of listening. 1, be quiet. If you can't remember be quiet, remember shut up. Close your lips. Don't interrupt. Some people will say to me, so how do I tell when the other person is done? Well, frankly, if you're really listening, you wouldn't even ask that question. I don't sit there when Donna's speaking to me and go, how do I tell when she's finished? I mean, will there be some sign from heaven that she's finally done with this story? I mean, if that's on my mind, then I'm already not listening. You see? No, I'm fascinated. She, in fact, might be talking about a subject that by itself would not interest me. I was talking with one of my sons one day, and he was talking to me about a subject that I have no interest in whatever. None. Zero. The subject alone. I would never talk about it. I would never do it. For anybody else, I'd say, go talk to the wall. But one of my other sons was in the room. And so the son who was talking to me left the room. And the second son said to me, do you have any interest in that subject? And I said, none. He said, well, I didn't think so. You looked like you were fascinated. I said, well, I wasn't pretending. Because what I was fascinated by wasn't the subject. Well, what was I listening to? I wasn't listening to a discussion of whatever, a movie or a video game or a place that he'd been or what. No, I'm fascinated by the person. When you're really listening, you won't want them to stop, as opposed to impatiently tapping your foot and wondering when they will. Really, that's what real listening is. You can't pretend this. But let's answer the question anyway. So how do you tell if the other person's done? Because people persist in asking that, no matter what I say. They'll stop talking. Really. They'll eventually stop. And I don't mean for a quarter second. Most people are just waiting for that quarter second pause, and then they leap in and tell their story. But even if the other person does stop, they might simply be pausing. They might be, for example, stunned that you, a boneheaded non-listener for life, are actually listening for a second, and they might be just shocked. They might be catching their breath. They might be pausing for you to give some indication that you are listening with a question or some kind of response. Who knows? If you have any doubt at all whether the other person is finished or has more to say, ask. You might say, there's something I'd like to say here, but I don't want to interrupt you. Are you finished with that subject, or would you like to say more? It's kind of obvious, isn't it? Another element of listening, or another characteristic, is to express your acceptance non-verbally. One of the most important things that we can do as we're listening is to, it sounds so obvious, look at the speaker and stop whatever we're doing. If Donna comes in the room and sits in the chair next to me, I stop working on the computer, I stop what I'm doing, I stop watching the movie, I pause the football game, whatever it is, look over at her, and I don't need to do anything else. Just look. And then she starts talking. You can't watch TV, you can't play a video game, you can't read a book, you can't be doing something else and be listening to somebody. It's impossible. A, it can't be done physically. You can't be simultaneously paying attention 100% to two things. And B, the other person's not going to feel listened to. In fact, Scott Peck said about 100 years ago, you cannot truly listen to anybody and do anything else at the same time. True. True then, true now. So back to expressing your acceptance nonverbally. Some studies indicate that as much as 93% of human communication is nonverbal. Facial expression, the slightest frown. I used to do this intentionally to people just to make the point so I could use it in talks. But somebody's watching you as they're talking, and all you have to do is just move your brow like, a millimeter. They notice. Turn down one corner of your mouth. Change your posture. Lean toward or away. Movement gives away whether you're listening or you're not, or gives away what you think, whether you're twitchy or squirming in your seat, or your arm position, whether your arms are crossed across your chest, or your hands are in an open and sort where your palms up position, palms down, the position of your feet. It goes on and on. Tone of voice. There's so many nonverbal ways that we can indicate acceptance and listening. And that is often more important than the words. So, for example, how many times have you heard somebody ask you, especially when you were a child, why did you do it that way? Now, I can record that little expression, that question, why did you do it that way, on a computer, and you would have no idea what the meaning is. But if I say, why did you do it that way? I'm fascinated that you did it that way. I do that fairly regularly with my son, Rob, who's the mechanical engineer, and he'll come here to the house and I'll be doing something with him, and suddenly he breaks out this crazy move. He does things differently. And I asked him that question, why'd you do it that way? Because the subtext of that, from my tone of voice and my facial expression and my leaning in toward him and my eyes widening and who knows how many other things, the subtext of my question is, I would never have thought of that. I'm asking to learn. He's my son, and I'm asking him to teach me. He is the master of mechanical engineering. I am not. However, if my tone of voice is different, why did you do it that way? And the way I move my head and my eyes and so on, the subtext is pretty clear to everybody. Idiot. Why'd you do it that way, idiot? Or why did you not do it the right way, parenthesis, my way? So the nonverbal communications, like everything, just like when somebody, criticizes you and then they say, I was just trying to help. Those are the right words, but delivered with an annoying tone of voice, they become a real lie, and people hate to be lied to. If we're not accepting, there's only one thing left. If we don't communicate accepting with our nonverbal communication, then we're communicating attacking, criticizing, and then the other person is going to defend themselves or shut up, and you lose. You may win the argument, but you lose because there's no love, which is the whole purpose, remember, for communicating. Another way to communicate listening, or that demonstrates listening. Every time another person is sharing who she is creating opportunities for you to see, accept, and love her. So if you criticize her when she speaks, she'll stop talking or defend herself, and your relationship will be seriously damaged. We claim to have an interest in listening, but then when people speak, we often reveal that our real goal is to argue with them. We ask them a question, but we're not really listening to their answer. We're using it as material to load in our gun and shoot them with. We trap them in their words. We even beat them down with the evidence that they've provided with their own mouths. We bait them. When they speak, for example, often the first word out of our mouths is but, like we talked about before. To be sure, we may have something brilliant to add to the conversation. We might know more than the person that's speaking. But when we say the word but, we might as well say, I'm not really listening to you. My real goal is to be right. When we criticize and contradict people, we feel powerful or we look good by comparison. And the people that we're talking with feel it when we use them like that. Example that I saw a while ago. So a woman was talking to her friend and her husband was there. And she said, on Tuesday, Fred and I, that was her husband, we were watching a movie and she couldn't even finish the sentence. He interrupts and says, it was Wednesday. How many of you have heard this kind of thing? They say, well, we drove 50 miles. No, it was 53 miles, says the other person. Well, as the Brits would say, who bloody cares? It turns out nobody cares what day it was. Nobody cared then. Nobody cares now. And as a result of the correction, her face fell. She was deflated and she quit talking, which is one of the consequences of our not listening. People around us will stop talking. Some people repeat themselves more when we don't listen, and some people just shut up. You lose either way. This particular example I call editing. We edit the words people say. Well, there are 4 crows on the fence. No, it's 5. The creek rose to 3 feet above flood stage. No, it was 2.9 feet. You're kidding me. It's a form of just absolutely needless information giving. It's really criticizing. Sometimes criticizing is in the form of defending. She says, you always leave your clothes on the floor. And he says, well, no, not always. I picked up my socks on April 15. That's criticizing. Sometimes criticizing is obvious, like attacking. So she says, you always leave your clothes on the floor. And he comes back with, well, like you don't. Your stuff's all over the house. And your makeup in the bathroom, geez, give me a break. How many of you have heard these conversations? If there's anybody listening who hasn't heard 1,000 conversations like this, I'd be shocked. We correct and criticize each other absolutely all day long. And as a result, we don't feel listened to, and then, shock, we don't feel loved. This is how this happens. Just with a failure to listen to the simplest sentence. I suggest, in fact, an experiment. Watch. Just observe. Don't criticize, judge. Just watch for how often the people around you modify what the speaker says. Edit, criticize, change, add to, whatever. Then, if you really want this experiment to be useful, watch for how often you do it. Watch for modifying in any way, and then ask, was it really necessary? Because people are very fond of saying when they modify what somebody says, well, but what they said wasn't accurate. It wasn't right or exact. That is a worthless excuse. Nobody cares about the details when they speak. What they care about is whether you care about them. Your modifications of other people are rarely necessary. If somebody in your household falls down on the floor with a heart attack and you say, call 911, and you hear the caller tell the ambulance to go to the wrong end of town, then you get to modify. Pretty much short of that, you get to shut up. So the examples where modification is necessary are almost never. I discovered a few cases when I was in the emergency room where I needed to modify an order that somebody had given because it would kill the patient, or I needed to modify something that I was doing in the operating room. Okay, those things mattered, but on the whole, it's not. Giving advice without the other person asking for it is almost always a form of criticism, whether you mean to or not. The other person is usually satisfied with how they're doing it, or usually they would ask for your opinion. So but out. We need to ask ourselves. You need to ask yourself. I need to ask myself. Which is more important to you? To correct the details that another person is speaking, or to love them? Which is more important? Because the answer will determine how happy you are. So when do you correct people? If somebody's going to die, if an order at work will be sent to the wrong address. But like, what, for example, if your spouse is driving and takes the wrong turn? So what? Unless you're about to be, late to taking a plane to get on a cruise to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and you have to be there on time, shut up. So you'll be wherever you're going 3 minutes later. Again, who cares? Another element of listening is to restate what you hear, or what I call 8. So, an example, couple's in the car and she says to him, we agreed, after they've gotten in the car, she says, we agreed that we'd leave the house tonight at 8, and it's now 8:10. Now, how could he respond productively? How could he listen? Well, first, let's do some examples of what not listening would be. So he could say, let's say it was 8:02. He could say, well, I was only 2 minutes late. No, that's not listening. It's defensive and unloving. What is the subject of her conversation, even though she's talking about time and leaving the car? What's the subject? We've already talked about this. Her. The subject's her. So if he's listening, he says, you're right. And I do that a lot. I focus on what I think is more important, like getting some last minute thing done, which doesn't really matter, or I wait till the last possible minute to get ready, and I don't make you more important than whatever little thing it is that I'm doing. I'm late a lot, and I want to change that. I'll be more careful. Don't say I'll never do it again, because you will. I'll be more careful, but I'll probably still need help. So if I'm late, and this is a big one, big part of 8, I'm asking you to say something to me if I'm late, every time. That is an example of 8. And what I mean by that is, if I say to you, the reason I choose the word 8, if I say to you 2, 4, 6, what did I say? And you say 2, 4, 6, well, you're just repeating. You're doing the communication technique of active listening, which is usually worthless. I could hire a parrot to do that. But if I say to you 2, 4, 6, what did I say? And you respond with 8. You just demonstrated genuine understanding of what I was saying by providing the next item in the list. So she tells him, you were late to the car, and he says, I do that a lot, and I do it with a lot of things. He provided the next thing without her saying it. That's 8. Here's an example of more than 8. What if he said, when I'm late, I'm telling you that I don't care about you. That's what she really has been trying to tell him for the last 35 years. And he says, and I do it in other ways too. Like, you don't like it when I throw my clothes on the floor when I'm getting in the shower, but I do it anyway. That's listening, because he can continue the sequence. It's very cool. It's a very cool form of listening. The other person feels like, wow, cool. So he finally heard me. Another way that we can indicate listening, or another characteristic of listening, is ask questions. In fact, you can begin with questions before the other person's even spoken. So your spouse comes in and you say, well, how was work? Now, we usually quit listening right there. We do it as a courtesy, kind of like, it's like, how are you doing? You're fine. Or like asking our kids, what did you learn at school today? Nothing. What'd you do? Nothing. So they go to school and they just, lock them in a little, casket, and they make them do nothing all day. So your spouse comes in, you say, how was work? And you say, how was work? And your spouse says, it was a hard day. We tend to change the subject and say, yeah, I had a hard day too. You just hijacked the conversation. No, listening means you stop everything you're doing, put down the paper, pause the football game, quit texting. You look at her and you say, well, tell me about it. So she complains for a while about whatever. She states something that she said to somebody at work. And then you say, well, so then what did he say to that? Or what happened? By asking questions, you're begging the other person to tell you more. That's even cooler than listening. It's asking for more input. Or did anybody at work actually listen to you at all today? Questions can be such a cool form of involvement. And as you increase your involvement in any conversation with another person, he or she will sense more interest from you and will feel more accepted and loved. Earlier, we talked about our tendency to give sympathy instead of listening. So one example was a friend says that her mother died, or a child is struggling at school, and we tend to say things like, oh, I'm so sorry. And I talked about how that's really sympathy and not understanding, because they may not be sorry. So how do we demonstrate real understanding and listening? One of the ways is what's right there on the PowerPoint. Ask. I love to go to funerals. I love to be at the bedside of people who are dying, talk to them, talk to their families, because I'm genuinely interested in them. And so when somebody tells me my mother died, I say, well, how are you doing with this? They're stunned. They go, well, nobody's asked me that. They say, well, part of me is sad because, she's not here with me anymore. And part of me, frankly, is doing a dance. I mean, everybody's telling me how sorry they are, and I'm celebrating because she's been in pain pretty much, for the last 20 months, and I've just felt so helpless, not knowing what to do. I said, how are you doing with this? Remember, when somebody says, my mother died, we get confused by the words. Die, oh, that's terrible, I have to say I'm sorry. Mother, about the mother. No! What's the subject? Her, person who's speaking. So you don't change the subject and ask how they're doing. Or they say, I have a child struggling in school. And so you say, well, how are you doing with the kid struggling in school? Is that something you're having a hard time with? Again, you're listening, you're not changing the subject. Often, you ask questions without the other person even speaking with words. People often speak without words. They speak with their facial expression. They speak with their posture. Peter Drucker, who's kind of the king dog from way back in business leadership, said the most important thing in communication is to hear what is not being said. So you ask questions several times a day, 20 times a day if I'm paying attention, and less if I'm not. I just look at Donna's face. I'd like to see her face, but I'm looking for signs of how she's doing, because you can tell without her saying anything. So I see her face furrowed. I see her brow furrowed, and say, so how are you doing? And mean it. And she says, well, my head hurts, which was kind of my first bet. And then I follow up with a question. Do you need anything from me? She may not. I don't solve it. Well, then just go take some Motrin. Guys tend to fix things, If you're a hammer, everything's a nail. She knows that I'm genuinely interested. We've talked at length about how to listen to others when they are speaking with or without words. Sometimes we need to listen while we are speaking. Sounds contradictory, but no. While we're speaking, we're affecting another person. And they're communicating back, and we need to listen to that. People are telling us where they are all the time. While we're speaking, we can also listen by paying attention to how the other person is responding to what we're saying. We're telling a story, for example, about whatever, and we love
the details. You will not believe how much I saved on this purse. Well, and the coupon, and in the end, the store paid me $3,000 to take this purse out of the store. We love the details, but the other person doesn't, or they may not. And the only way to learn that is to pay attention. So while we're speaking, we need to pay attention and see if their interest is decreasing, talk less. We might even ask. So I've talked about my whatever it is. You might talk about shopping, and I would be talking about digging ditches and moving rocks in the backyard, which fascinates me and turns out fascinates very few other people. So you would ask, what would you like to talk about? If they seem tired, ask. You might say, you seem distracted. You don't say, I'm offended that you seem distracted by what I'm saying. You seem distracted. Would you rather finish this another time? I'm fine with that. You're paying attention to the person you're talking to. If you see pain, because it turns out on many occasions, I've said something to somebody, they heard a word different than I'd actually said, and I could see that they're offended. So I stop what I'm saying instead of continuing to talk and go, I just saw a look of pain flicker across your face. Tell me what you heard right before you felt that pain, because it may not have been what I said. Now, it may have been, but either way, you get to deal with it. You're listening to the other person. There are physical evidences of listening. So, for example, we talked about this one, looking. It's very intimate to look into somebody's eyes. Try it sometime. A man called me and he said, that he and his wife were distant. They lived virtually at other ends of the house. He said, I don't know what to do. I said, all right, hang up the phone. Go find your wife wherever she is. Turns out she was in the kitchen. Hold her by both arms, gently, not pin her against the wall, and just look into her eyes. That's it. Don't speak. In fact, in his particular case, I recommended that he especially don't speak. Just look. And he calls back an hour later and said, she just melted. It's very intimate. If we look and the other person feels like we look and we're caring, it's tender. If we look directly into somebody's eyes and they're not sure if we care about them, can actually be quite threatening. Another evidence, physical evidence of listening, is touching. And I would recommend you do this only if, A, you're really confident about it. If you're uncomfortable touching other people, they're going to be uncomfortable too. And if the other person is comfortable, I touch people as I'm talking a lot. I do it all the time. Anybody who knows me knows I do it. They know that I mean it. I like touching people because it's more connecting. I don't sit and think about it. It would be more connecting if I were to actually reach out and touch their, let's see, right shoulder. No, not like that. It just naturally feels more connecting. I came back recently from speaking for 2.5 weeks in England. And people told me, they said, the Brits do not like to be touched. And I thought, I don't believe it. So I just touched people like I do any place else. I'd be sitting in restaurants and people would be sitting on my lap. I'd be touching them on the shoulder or on the cheek or what. They love it. In fact, midway through a seminar, a 75-year-old man in England came walking up to me and hobbled, actually, up to the little stage there. And he said, after he'd watched 50 other people get touched in some way, and he said, would you be willing to give me my very first hug? Yeah. We want to be touched safely, not just touched randomly. And if somebody is touching you while you're speaking, you can almost not escape the conclusion that they're listening to you, because by the touching, they're already showing you that they feel close to you. Another physical evidence of listening is posture. As somebody speaks, if you lean in toward them, they get the idea that you're interested. They back away. If you back away, they get the idea that you're not. If your arms are folded across your chest, that's a fairly universally recognized stance of being defensive. The posture of your feet, no kidding. They've studied everything, I think. But we're talking to somebody, but our feet are pointed away from them, almost like we're preparing to run away. So how could you do that and actually communicate to them that you care about them, that you're listening? Another piece of physical evidence of listening is activity. You can't be doing anything else. So another way of learning how to listen, and this is just kind of a different approach, is, and you'll find this in the books, is the rules of seeing. Let's look just at the first two. Only one person can speak at a time. You cannot hijack the conversation. One person, whoever speaks, and the second one is whoever speaks first is the speaker. So two people walk into a room and the other person speaks to you, that's the speaker. Until they give up the position of speaker, your job is to listen. George Marshall was the Army Chief of Staff during World War II, and he had command of millions of men. And he was asked how he worked so well with people. And he said this: listen to the other person's story first. 2, listen to the other person's full story. 3, listen to the other person's full story first. Listen, dang it, he might just as well have said, the short version. Back to the rules of seeing. Let's look at the last two. The speaker is describing himself. We already talked about this. This is just another way of covering much of what we've already talked about. When somebody talks, they're talking about themselves. We get distracted by the words. So when somebody comes at you and they say, you did this wrong and you did, and you, we get distracted by the word you. And so what do we respond to? Us. And we respond with something about us because we heard the word you 5 times in a row. The subject is not us. The subject is how something we did or said affected them. They're the subject. Now, how do you listen as a wise person? Different goals. When you're listening to somebody as a friend, the speaker's describing themselves, you stay with that subject. If you can't be a wise man, get one. Now, this is a new subject, how to listen as a wise person. As a friend, you just listen to love. As a wise person, now you're loving and teaching. So it becomes different. Once somebody has asked you to be their wise person, and it will be pretty clear, they'll say, will you help me with this? Can you be a wise person for me? Unless they make that really clear, unless you're the person's parent or boss, you have not been enlisted as a wise person. So if you are enlisted as a wise person, then you might employ the 5 W's in listening, which have been used well in some groups and have been used way too militaristically in others. Some people think that you can't respond unless you use the 5 W's, as though these were somehow hard and fast rules, which I find fairly amusing. I've actually been on calls where people have corrected me and told me that I needed to use the 5 W's, and I didn't tell them what I wrote the dang things, and no, I don't really have to use them. But they can be useful. So when somebody speaks to you as a wise person, you explore first, what did they do? What did the other person do that they're talking about? What did you do? Why did you both behave as you did? Which is almost always because we didn't feel loved. Knowing what you know now, what would you do differently the next time? And what can you do about it right this minute? And if you want to read a whole lot more about that, you can read about it in the book, Real Love for Wise Men and Women. This fourth one is probably the hardest one. most people really can't see how they could respond differently. First, they have to know that you care about them, or nothing else will work. And how do they know? Because you're really listening. People can't change their behavior. They can't see what they can do differently until they really get that feeling of being loved. I have a friend who's been in real love for like 8 years, and it wasn't until recently, like the last few months, that he finally understood what it meant to feel unconditionally loved. And only then could he listen to what I'd been telling him for 8 years. So as a wise person, until you help somebody, until you can see that somebody is feeling loved by you, they're probably not going to be able to answer this one. And you're going to wonder, well, why do they keep doing the same stupid thing year after year after year after year? Sometimes you actually have to help people listen by describing what they're doing. And sometimes it can seem almost brutal. Some people have listened so poorly for so long that unless you have the courage and unless you're loving enough to describe what they're doing and how they're not listening, that they're never going to see it. So, for example, I was talking to somebody just a few days ago, and I said, among other things, I said, when I speak to you, this is me talking to the person on the phone, you respond with one or more of the following. Either you ignore me completely and keep talking, that's the most common thing you do, or you argue with me, or you tell me how you're right, or you change the subject, or you sulk. And I gave this particular person, a man in this case, illustrations of how he had done each of those things just in the last 5 minutes. Unless we help people to listen and show them when they're not, very often they really are never going to learn how to do it because nobody in their life's ever listened to them. How are they going to just suddenly pick up on listening to other people? So when we're asked as wise men and wise women, then maybe we can teach people more directly about how to listen. I would not particularly suggest you do this with your spouse right off. You'd have to have a pretty long-standing relationship and a willingness to listen before your partner would have to be willing to listen before you could say this. Ralph Nichols said the most basic of all human needs is the need to understand and be understood. And the best way to understand people is to listen to them. Wilson Misner. A good listener is not only popular everywhere, but after a while, he actually knows something because he's listening. Now, how do we make listening difficult for other people? It's pretty difficult for people to listen to us when we're afraid. Now, this one's kind of subtle, but I talked to a lady one day and she said, nobody listens to me. Now, she's not an attacker. It's really kind of obvious why people would have a difficult time listening to us if we are, for example, punching them in the face, which is what criticism and anger are like, emotionally speaking. I said, you make it difficult for people to listen to you because you're afraid. She said, I don't get it. If I'm afraid, wouldn't they listen to me more? Well, yeah, if they were loving, they would. But if people are not already unconditionally loving and you're afraid as you speak, it scares them because they don't know what to do to help you. They don't know what to do with your fear. It confuses them. They feel helpless. Fear is also contagious. They don't know what to do with you. So what do? They just shut down, go away. Or they try to fix you. And they try to fix you. Why? So they'll be comfortable. This why. We make it difficult for people to listen when we use any of the getting and protecting behaviors. We make it difficult when we're not listening to them. Many of us tend to instead of asking questions, for example, we issue challenges. With all of these behaviors, we frighten people. And it's really difficult for people to listen to us when they're frightened. Let me give you some examples of, and I can only give you a few, of what not listening and listening could look like. So somebody says, you just don't pay any attention to me. Now, not listening would look like this. Oh, like you give me the attention I want. See, you've changed the subject. Or you could actually listen and say, I really don't. How about if I pay attention to you right now? See how listening that, you see, it just softens your heart to hear that. I was wrong not to listen to you. What can I do now? Or, you're right, I don't. Give me an example of where I have not paid attention to you, and I'll see if I can come up with a way where I can listen, where we can change that. That's listening. Or the example that I used earlier when I was talking about the kid in the grocery store. Mommy, 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 mommy. Not listening is doing nothing, which is what so often happens with these kids. Or I'm busy right now, or it's often as dismissive as a gesture. The parent just goes like this, or keeps talking to the adult who's next to them. What would listening look like? Our children never repeated themselves. Our children didn't cry in stores. Our children didn't cry with other adults around, because if a child spoke, when a child speaks, the world has to stop and you have to listen. That doesn't mean you have to give the child what they want. So it's 15 minutes before dinner and the child says, Mommy, I would like a gallon of ice cream. Well, that doesn't mean you have to give the kid a gallon of ice cream. But you can stop what you're doing and say, what can I do for you, sweetie? And the kid says, well, I want a gallon of ice cream. Me too. We're going to have dinner in a minute. You can have an apple slice between now and then. Well, I want ice cream. Because parents say to me, well, they'll just keep asking for ice cream. Sure they will, because you've never listened to them. When children feel really listened to, they tend not to be as repetitive and not as demanding. Somebody says, for example, I hate Christmas. I've heard adults do this. And non-listeners go, really? Well, I love Christmas. The lights, the music, people smiling. They didn't hear the person speak at all. I hate Christmas. What's the subject? Them. And we respond with, well, but I don't hate Christmas. Well, they didn't ask you if you liked Christmas or hated Christmas. Listening would be, tell me, what do you hate about it? And suddenly you're going to learn all kinds of cool things about that person. I hated Christmas for most of my life, and I didn't know why, until somebody finally listened to me when I described hating Christmas and why I did. One partner says to the other, all you ever do is push me to have sex. And the partner that they're talking to says, well, that's not true. Well, that's the end of the listening there. As opposed to, I really can be pretty insistent. And when I want something, I tend not to think about you. So when I want sex, how would you like me to say that to you? How can I ask in a way that you would not feel pushed? Now, that's a kind of touchy subject with a lot of couples, and so you might need the help of a wise man here. But these are just a few examples of what not listening, which is the norm as in 98% of the time, is like, versus what genuine listening looks like. So we've given you some actual examples of listening, characteristics of listening, characteristics of not listening, why we listen, why we don't listen. If you put it all together, it really still comes down to listening is where I focus on you. It's not a technique. So we'll talk a little bit more about listening in the next lesson, but this is huge. You want to begin to learn to love? Learn to listen. Nice to be here with you. Talk to you next week.